It began in silence, a narrow stream cutting through the Derbyshire hills, its waters dark with winter melt, running cold beneath the shadow of the quarry. At dawn on a February morning in 1876, a miner named Samuel Briggs followed that stream down from the Bonsall slope. He was searching for a lost tool, a hammer he'd dropped the day before, but what he found instead made him drop to his knees. There, caught against the reeds and stones, was a small bundle of cloth. Pale, water-soaked linen. Inside, the still body of a child. Within hours, word spread through the village. The women whispered from doorway to doorway. The men left the alehouse mid-pint to stand in the lane and stare toward the quarry path. In a place like Bonsall, a tight weave of cottages, workshops, and gossip, tragedy did not stay private for long. By midday, the constable from Matlock had arrived, and the child was carried to the parish room. The coroner's order was clear. The body was to be examined, and every mother in the village accounted for. That was how her name first appeared in the record. Mary Ellen Ward, aged 27, a mill hand's widow living alone in a single-room cottage on High Street. When the authorities came to Mary Ellen's door, she did not run. Neighbors later said she stood at the threshold with a child's blanket clutched to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes dry as though she'd already wept herself empty. The constable asked where her baby was. She looked past him, toward the quarry slope, and said quietly, "Gone, sir. He's gone to the water." That single sentence sealed her fate. The inquest was held 2 days later at the King's Head Inn, a low-ceilinged room heavy with smoke and whispers. The coroner unwrapped the soaked linen, revealing a boy of perhaps 6 months. No bruises, no marks, only the water in his lungs. The doctor's verdict was plain: death by drowning. The coroner asked whether any witness had seen Mary Ellen near the quarry. A labourer spoke of a figure crossing the field at dusk. Another recalled hearing a woman sobbing near the brook. Nothing certain, but in a village like Bonsall, certainty mattered less than suspicion. By the week's end, the headlines reached beyond Derbyshire. Terrible crime in Bonsall, a mother accused. Yet to understand what led a mother to that cold water, we must step back into the world that made her, broke her, and finally judged her. Long before the newspapers called her a monster, Mary Ellen Ward had been invisible. She was born in the spring of 1849 in a miner's cottage halfway between Bonsall and Cromford. Her father was a lead dresser, her mother a washerwoman, who rose before dawn to scrub other people's linen in the same icy water that would, years later, claim her daughter's child. Poverty wasn't something you fell into in Bonsall. It was the ground you were born on. By 16, Mary Ellen was working at the mill in Matlock, Bath, where the air hung thick with lint and the rhythm of the machines never stopped. Those who remembered her from those years said she was quiet but steady, a girl who sang softly under her breath when she thought no one could hear. She married at 19 to a young carter named Thomas Ward. For a while, it seemed she had done what few working girls managed. She'd escaped the worst of it. They rented a small room above a wheelwright's shop, and on Sundays she wore a shawl that Thomas had bought her from a market stall in Bakewell. But good fortune was fragile in places like Bonsall. One winter, Thomas was crushed beneath a load of timber on the steep road to Cromford. By the time Mary Ellen reached the infirmary, he was gone. The parish gave her 2 shillings a week and told her to make do. She took in sewing when there was work, washing when there wasn't. The neighbours said she kept herself clean and her rent paid. But there was a weariness about her, the kind that settled in after too many disappointments. When her child was born the following spring, she named him William, after her father, and held him as though he were her last defence against the world. But the world closed in quickly. Prices rose. The mill cut wages. The landlord began asking for rent in advance. Women in her situation were often forced into the workhouse, a place known locally as the Bastille, where families were split apart and infants sent to the infirm ward. Mary Ellen would have known what that meant. To enter the workhouse was to lose your child. Somewhere in those long months, between the hunger, the shame, and the fear of the parish officers, something inside her began to falter. One neighbour recalled seeing her walking toward the quarry at dusk, murmuring to herself. Another said she had spoken once of rest and peace, but none took it seriously. The church taught that a mother's love was sacred, that a woman's virtue was her salvation. But what happens when the world strips both away? By the winter of 1876, Mary Ellen had stopped attending church altogether. The fire in her hearth went cold, and when the baby's crying pierced the night, there was no one left to hear her whisper, "Hush now, love. It'll soon be quiet." On the evening of February 14, 1876, the wind swept through Bonsall with a sharp, metallic edge. Smoke from the chimneys was dragged low over the cottages, and the lanes were slick with thawing frost. Inside her small rented room, Mary Ellen Ward wrapped her infant son in a thin wool blanket and pressed him to her chest. The candle on the table had already burned to a stub. No one knows precisely what she thought in those hours. The court later spoke of a woman overcome by wickedness. But the truth, if we could have seen it, would likely have been quieter, a slow unraveling of hope, thread by thread. She had gone 3 days without food herself, saving what little she could for the child. The parish officer had called that morning, warning that arrears in rent would see her summoned before the board. And the neighbor who sometimes watched the baby while Mary Ellen worked had taken ill. There was, in every direction, nowhere left to turn. Just after dusk, she wrapped the child tightly in a shawl, stepped into the lane, and began walking toward the quarry. The village lamps were few, and the road beyond the mill was all but swallowed by darkness. Witnesses later claimed they'd seen her there, a lone figure on the rise, but no one stopped her. People rarely did. Poverty made one invisible. The quarry stream was little more than a trickle in summer, but in February it ran fast, fed by snowmelt and rain. It cut through the hillside like a wound. Mary Ellen stood there a long while, rocking the child in her arms, whispering to him, as though to soothe them both. Some said they heard her singing, a lullaby carried on the wind. Then, according to her own statement, she knelt by the water's edge. He was cold, she told the constable later. "I only meant to wash his face." The stream surged. The baby slipped from her grasp. When the first splash came, she reached instinctively, but the current took him, turning the bundle over and away, the pale fabric drifting downstream until it vanished beyond the bend. She stood there, frozen, as the sound of the water filled the night. What followed was a blur of footsteps and fear. She ran part way down the bank, calling his name, but it was useless. The moon broke through the clouds just long enough to show her hands, trembling and wet. She walked back toward the village, her shawl heavy with water, her face expressionless. At some point, she stopped at the chapel door, sat on the step, and waited for morning. When Samuel Briggs found the child at first light, the constable was called within the hour. And when he arrived at Mary Ellen's cottage, the hearth was cold, the cradle empty, and the floor wet with muddy footprints. She didn't deny what she'd done. "He's gone to the water," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. It was not the confession of a killer, but the surrender of someone who no longer saw a path back to mercy. When the constable led Mary Ellen Ward through the streets of Bonsall, the village fell silent. Women stood in their doorways, hands clasped at their aprons. Men doffed their caps not in respect, but in uneasy recognition. Everyone knew her name now. In a place so small, shame traveled faster than pity. She was taken first to the Matlock lockup, a narrow stone cell that smelled of lime and damp wool, before being transferred to the Derby County Jail. The I charge read aloud to her was stark and simple. That you did feloniously and with malice, aforethought kill and murder your male child. At the inquest 2 days later, the coroner, Mr. Hadley, sat at the head of a long oak table inside the King's Head Inn. Around him, a jury of 12 local men, farmers, tradesmen, and one parish clerk adjusted their collars and waited for the proceedings to begin. Mary Ellen was brought in under guard, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. The first to speak was the doctor who had examined the child. He confirmed what all had feared. The boy had drowned, water filling his lungs. There were no bruises, no sign of violence. Then came the constable, who recounted her statement with bureaucratic precision, the words that would seal her fate. "He's gone to the water." When asked if she wished to say anything, Mary Ellen only whispered, "I did not mean harm." The verdict of the inquest was willful murder. From that moment, the case leapt from local tragedy to national sensation. The Derby Mercury devoted a column to it, describing her as a woman of melancholy aspect and sullen silence. The Nottingham Journal printed an editorial on the decline of the maternal instinct. Readers thousands of miles away formed opinions about a woman they had never seen, in a village they could not find on a map. Her trial opened at the Derby Assizes in early March. The courtroom was crowded. Reporters, clergymen and curious townsfolk filled the gallery until even the aisles were standing room only. The prosecution painted a picture of premeditation, a mother driven not by madness but by cruelty. They spoke of her debts, her isolation, her despair, twisting each into motive. Her appointed counsel, a thin young solicitor from Bakewell, argued otherwise. He pleaded that Mary Ellen's mind had given way under the weight of privation, that she was not wicked but broken. Several witnesses testified to her good character before her husband's death, but their voices were lost in the tide of moral outrage. When the judge addressed the jury, his tone left little doubt. "We are here not to excuse sin with sentiment, but to protect the innocent from those who would cast them into the dark." After 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty of murder, with a recommendation to mercy. Mary Ellen stood motionless as the judge placed the black cap upon his head. "You shall be taken from this place to a place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman fainted, but mercy, when it came, did not come from heaven. Within a week, the Home Office commuted her sentence to penal servitude for life, citing her fragile health and probable unsoundness of mind. She was sent first to Millbank, then to the women's prison at Woking, where she would vanish into the grey machinery of Victorian justice. The newspapers moved on to the next scandal. Bonsall returned to its quiet routines. But in the county records, beneath the official language of law and punishment, one note remains scrawled in the margin by an anonymous clerk. Prisoner wept when asked if she wished to see the child's shawl. At Woking Women's Prison, the walls were high and pale, not white, but a sickly, chalky hue that seemed to swallow the light. The corridors smelled of carbolic and wet stone, and the sound of boots on flagstones echoed endlessly through the silence. Mary Ellen Ward arrived there in the spring of 1876, one of nearly 400 women sentenced for crimes ranging from theft to murder. The matrons recorded her as age 29, height 5 feet 1 inch, brown hair, sallow complexion, occupation laundress. She was given the uniform of coarse gray serge, her name replaced by a number. Her first weeks were spent in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a narrow cell with only a Bible, a prayer book, and a bundle of oakum to pick apart. The work was meant to humble, to break pride. But for Mary Ellen, there was little pride left to break. Each morning began with the same ritual: a bell at dawn, the scrape of bolts, and a whispered roll call that turned women into entries in a ledger. Meals were meagre: porridge, gruel, bread so stale it cracked in the mouth. Talking was forbidden. The only voices allowed were those of the wardresses and the chaplain, whose sermons on repentance echoed hollowly through the hall. In the prison register, her behavior was marked quiet, obedient, melancholy. Once, a matron noted that she sang to herself at labor, though others said the sound was closer to weeping. Outside the prison walls, her name continued to flicker through the press, first with outrage, then with curiosity, and finally with pity. The Derby Mercury, which had once called her monstrous, now printed a softer piece. The prisoner Ward, it is said, conducts herself with extreme humility. Many hold that poverty and neglect were the true culprits in this sad affair. Yet in Bonsall itself the story never faded. The stream below the quarry came to be known among villagers as Mary Ellen's Brook. Mothers warned their children not to go near it after dark. Others left flowers there in secret, unsure whether it was an act of judgment or compassion. Years passed. Prison life consumed her youth. By 1882, she was transferred to Parkhurst, where convicts nearing release were sent for training and hard labor. But Mary Ellen was not among them. Her health had begun to fail. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, found its way easily into the lungs of women who lived in cold cells and breathed damp air. The last entry in her record, dated March 1883, reads simply, "Removed to infirmary." Not expected to recover, she died within the week. No relatives claimed the body. The burial register lists her grave as number 174, unmarked, unvisited. But her story did not end there. For years afterward, reformers and campaigners would invoke her case in speeches and pamphlets calling for compassion in the treatment of fallen women. One such writer, Clara Higgins, described her as a victim of circumstance, crushed by a society that forbade her to beg yet condemned her for starving. In time, her tragedy became a footnote, a case study in the moral contradictions of an age that praised motherhood while punishing mothers for being poor. If you walk through Bonsall today, the stream still runs cold beneath the quarry, winding its way through moss and stone. Locals say that when the mist rolls down the hill and the church bell tolls faintly through the valley, you can almost hear the echo of a lullaby, soft, trembling, and unfinished. And whether that sound is memory or myth hardly matters anymore. For Mary Ellen Ward, the world offered neither justice nor forgiveness, only the indifferent passing of time and the whisper of water over stone. In the end, Mary Ellen Ward's story is not just about a crime. It's about the silence that breeds beneath poverty. A silence so deep that when it finally breaks, the world calls it madness. Victorian England was built on progress, railways, factories, empire, yet behind every shining invention stood women like Mary Ellen, invisible, exhausted, and utterly alone. When she stood by that stream, she wasn't a monster. She was a mother at the edge of a world that offered no mercy. The newspapers condemned her. The court judged her. But the truth is, England itself was on trial. For every hungry child, every locked workhouse door, every prayer that went unanswered. And perhaps that's why her story still lingers. Not because of the crime, but because of the question it leaves behind. What would any of us do if the world stopped listening? If you close your eyes, you can almost see her, standing by the water, holding her child close for the last time. The cold wind, the quiet prayer, the unbearable choice. History called her a sinner. But time has a way of softening judgment, of reminding us that tragedy rarely belongs to villains, it belongs to people. And in that way, Mary Ellen Ward was never truly lost. She became part of the current, a warning, a whisper, a wound that still runs through the heart of the Victorian age.